Sometime later, Rachel stood at the scene where Joseph's father had met his end, speaking on the phone. She informed the director that they had a problem. Codename Sion had used force. As she stared at the pile of corpses, she relayed this information to the priest. The priest stood up, placing one hand on his desk, unable to believe Sion would resort to brute force. Rachel stepped on a guard who had barely survived, stating that she had tracked Sion and arrived at the location, but he had already left. Moreover, many seriously injured adult men were at the scene. Even if it was Sion, this should have been impossible due to the 3 absolute principles. She crouched down and carefully examined one of the bodies. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. "Nothing like this has ever happened in the history of Dead Mansion." The director gnawed at his finger, grasping the gravity of the situation tied to the 3 absolute principles. He opened the cupboard where records of the good children were stored. As the door swung open, books tumbled off the shelves, and one fell open, revealing a picture of unknown children with a red, "Sold Out" stamp across it. He informed Rachel that if Sion was indeed breaking the 3 absolute principles, something was gravely wrong. The director began to contemplate the possibility that these weapons they sold at the Dead Mansion might disregard their orders and turn against them instead. Picking up a book from the shelf, he ordered Rachel to change their objective. Rather than capturing Sion, she needed to investigate him first. "Keep a close watch on him and find out if he really used force without permission," the priest ordered. Rachel understood her assignment. She pressed down harder on the injured guard beneath her foot. While on the phone with the priest, she glanced away as 2 unfamiliar men approached. The 2 men offered their support, suggesting that if she needed any assistance in Korea, the White Tiger workforce would be at her service. One of the men, who was bald and combing his remaining hair with a small comb, smiled at Rachel. The other, larger man, wearing glasses and smoking, also glanced at her. The larger man asked how an elementary school student could cause such a massacre. Still combing his hair, the smaller man noted that dealing with this situation would make him lose even more hair. As Rachel walked towards them, she informed the priest that she had made contact with the smoker and the bar-coated head. She assured the priest that she would begin observing Sion immediately. Rachel ignored both of them, walking straight past while still fiddling with her phone. The 2 men watched her as she left. The burly man pondered over Rachel's attire, noting that a black latex suit seemed inappropriate for a nun. The bald man, pointing with his comb, remarked that Rachel was Russian and, like his wife, was more open-minded. The next day, Rachel arrived at Sion's school in disguise. After completing her preliminary investigation, she had determined that Sion was enrolled here and that his supposed parents were actually fictitious identities. As she walked through the school, she casually waved at a passing student. Rachel's curiosity about Sion was piqued. She was eager to discover what he was up to and learn everything about him. Smiling to herself, she gently touched her lips with her fingers, thrilled to see how much Sion had changed over the years. Rachel couldn't help but gush over Sion as she reminisced about their past. He had been the standout among all the children she'd trained, mastering every weapon with exceptional skill. She marveled at how independent and confident he had become. Peering through the classroom window, Rachel saw Sion slouched in a chair, a smug grin on his face. Sion was chatting with his classmates about Joseph when he suddenly clasped his hands in a mock prayer position and began imitating Joseph's pleas for mercy. Rachel's eyes widened in surprise as she questioned whether this arrogant blonde boy was truly the Sion she once knew. The other boys watched with growing disappointment as Sion continued to boast, dismissing Joseph's strength. Suddenly, the boy behind Sion, clearly irritated, stood up and complained that Sion was being too noisy and disturbing his rest. Sion's jaw tightened as he turned to face the annoyed boy. Both boys rose to their feet, and Rachel, observing from the window, couldn't help but widen her eyes in astonishment. Both boys locked eyes, and Rachel wondered if this was a battle for hierarchy, reminiscent of the fights at the Dead Mansion. Those were struggles to establish dominance and strength. She found it amusing how Sion even tried to challenge her back then. Whenever Sion fought his peers, he always emerged as the strongest. However, as soon as the fight began, the larger boy delivered a single blow that knocked Sion to the ground, leaving him curled up and defeated. It was clear who the strongest was. Rachel was confused, her eyes twitching at the sight. Sion was getting kicked by the bigger boy, desperately trying to shield his face. Frustrated, Rachel bit her lip and resolved to continue with her disguise later inside the classroom. Rachel then proceeded to read aloud from a book, pretending to teach the class. As she did, she began to understand Sion's motive a bit more. She realized that he couldn't carelessly show off his strength if he was trying to hide his true identity. She turned slightly, locking her eyes on Sion, pondering whether he was still under the influence of the three principles. She knew she had to observe him more closely. Sion seemed to be concentrating as he scribbled something in his textbook. When he looked up and fixed his gaze on Rachel, she knew he was different. She recalled that back at the dead mansion, the good children weren't only strong but also intelligent. Sion was always the most outstanding child. She remembered how he was able to solve puzzles while the rest of his peers struggled. Rachel walked toward Sion, closing her eyes and placing a finger on her lips while holding a couple of textbooks in her other hand. She thought to herself that Sion might be able to hide his powers, but he couldn't conceal his brilliance. Opening her eyes, her lips curled into a smile. Sion should at least try to conceal his intelligence if he wants to blend in, especially when she is teaching. When Rachel glanced at his notebook, she noticed a childlike drawing of stick figures, depicting the moment he hit Joseph with the fire extinguisher, accompanied by the words, "This is when it gets rough." Looking at Sion's work, Rachel was left dumbfounded. Sion held two pens between his fingers, intently concentrating on his drawing. "What do you think you're doing? This is class," Rachel exclaimed, striking Sion on the head with the two books she was holding. After class, Rachel retreated to the staff bathroom, sitting on the toilet with her arms resting on her knees and her face buried in her hands. She was in disbelief over what had become of Sion. In frustration, she removed her disguise and looked up with a blank expression. It was hard for her to accept that her beloved Sion she once knew had turned into such an ordinary child. Hugging her knees with her feet drawn close, she chewed on her thumb, reflecting on the oddity of the situation. Despite his familiar appearance, she couldn't detect a trace of the elegance that once defined him. With her eyes closed and her hands pressed against her head in frustration, she recalled the drawing Sion had made in class. She questioned whether it could all be a coincidence. Refusing to believe that the immature child before her could be the Sion she knew, she struggled to reconcile the two. Standing up with a resolute expression, Rachel announced, "Change of plans. This is no longer just about protecting the three absolute principles." She pulled her hair into a tight ponytail and left the bathroom. Transforming her disguise into that of a high school girl with long brown hair and glasses, Rachel was determined to uncover the truth about whether this child was truly the Sion she once cherished. Sion paused at the traffic light, gripping the strap of his bag with one hand and rubbing his head where Rachel had struck him in class. He grumbled about the lingering pain, musing that teachers usually don't hit that hard. Meanwhile, Rachel, concealed in her disguise, stood a few feet away, watching him intently. Unaware of her presence, Sion continued to ponder the unusual severity of the teacher's strike. Rachel, now only inches away from Sion, observed him closely. She resolved that if this boy wasn't the real Sion, he would face severe consequences at her hands. Suddenly, a woman called out to Sion. He turned slightly and made eye contact with her. It was Hyunho's mother, carrying 2 grocery bags. With a bright smile and a joyful expression, she was delighted to see Sion. She asked if he could help her carry the bags. Sion walked over to her at a relaxed pace, extending his hands to help carry the bags. Rachel observed closely, noting the change in his demeanor. As he assisted her, Hyunho's mother invited him to join her for tteokbokki. Rachel kept a watchful eye from the corner, puzzled by the identity of the newcomer and the sudden shift in Sion's demeanor. Sion, laughing, accepted Hyunho's mother's invitation to join her for a meal. At Hyunho's shop, Sion eagerly devoured the food prepared by Hyunho's mother. As she cooked rice, she turned slightly, closed her eyes, and smiled, gently advising Sion to eat more slowly. Meanwhile, Rachel sat beside him, staring blankly at the skewered meat she was holding. Rachel watched the mother closely, recalling Joseph's mention of her. Joseph was the one who had put her son into a coma. As Rachel held the skewered meat, she shifted her gaze to Sion, who was now eating slowly. She couldn't fathom what connection he had with Hyunho's mother. Rachel continued to watch Sion, feeling increasingly disgusted by the sight of him. The longer she observed, the more her irritation grew. Rachel focused intently on Sion, grappling with whether he could truly be the Sion she knew despite the identical face. As she took a bite of the skewered meat, she let out a scream, causing both Sion and the elderly woman to turn and face her in alarm. Rachel's face turned red as she stuck out her tongue and waved her hand, claiming the meat was too spicy and asking for some water. Sion, still eating his meat with a fork, cast a curious glance at Rachel. The old woman closed her eyes and handed Rachel a bottle of water, remarking that she couldn't handle spicy food. Rachel, still sticking out her tongue and sweating, gratefully accepted the bottle. Meanwhile, Sion continued to eat his spicy food, observing the exchange between them. Rachel closed her eyes, sweat still streaming down her face, and took a gulp of water. She found spicy food torturous and wondered how anyone could enjoy it. In her mind, those who ate such fiery dishes must be crazy. Rachel brought her hand to her mouth, thinking that Koreans must have a high tolerance for spice. She mused that such fiery food should be considered poison, or even an assassination attempt. Sion, with a knowing smile, remarked that she should have eaten more slowly, teasing her for being so clumsy. Rachel fixed her gaze on Sion, her thumb pressed against her lips and veins bulging with visible irritation. The remark had clearly struck a nerve, and she seethed with the desire to kill him. She vowed silently to herself that she would make him pay. Rachel remembered the first time Sion tried spicy food. She had held his hand, her face etched with concern, as he tasted it for the first time. His reaction had mirrored her own, unable to handle the intense heat. Recalling Sion's low tolerance for spicy food, Rachel thought to herself that he must be struggling if he's still in Korea. After quenching her own discomfort with water, she glanced at Sion's hand. His fists were clenched and visibly shaking. The old woman beamed at Sion and asked how he liked the food. Sion closed his eyes and smiled, giving a thumbs up as he declared that it was delicious. Rachel, observing their interaction, could see through his lie and knew he wasn't being truthful. Rachel took another sip of water, wondering why Sion was so eager to eat everything the old woman served. He could have easily refused her food if he didn't want it. As she reflected on their interaction over the past 30 minutes, starting from when the old woman asked Sion to help with her bags, and he complied, to when she invited him to eat, and he accepted, Rachel's eyes widened. It became clear to her that Sion must view this old woman as a parental figure. The old woman asked Sion if he could help her carry some boxes. With a smile, he readily agreed to lift the heavy load. Rachel, watching this interaction, realized that Sion followed the old woman's every request without hesitation. Given his adherence to the 3 principles, this level of obedience seemed surprising even for him. Rachel observed that it was implausible for Sion to act so obediently without some form of command. The only plausible explanation was that someone had instructed him to target Byungwoo Construction, and the most likely candidate for this order was the old woman. According to the Dead Mansion's first principle, a parent's words are absolute. Rachel concluded that Sion must regard the old woman as a parental figure, which explained his compliance with her commands. With this realization, everything seemed to fall into place. Rachel handed the old woman some money for the food, and the old woman smiled, saying she would need a moment to find some change. As the old woman turned her back to Rachel, Rachel seized the moment to test her theory. With swift precision, she hurled a sharp stick at the woman, but Sion was quicker. He raised a fork to intercept the stick, preventing it from reaching the old woman. Sion leapt off the stool behind him, using his right hand to steady himself on the counter. With the fork still in his left hand, he lunged toward Rachel. She couldn't help but smile wickedly, her eyes widening and cheeks flushing red as Sion's hand edged closer to her mouth. The stool behind the old woman toppled, startling her. She spun around, only to find that both Rachel and Sion had disappeared. Notably, Rachel had left without taking her change. The Dead Mansion's third principle for good children states that if a parent's safety is threatened, one must disregard the principles and resolve the situation. Rachel smiled as she gripped the wooden skewer stick, preparing to take a jab at Sion. Rachel's eyes were locked on Sion as she aimed to stab him. Sion swiftly dropped his left shoulder, causing her to miss her mark, though her attack managed to leave a scratch on his cheek. Reacting quickly, Sion attempted to counter with a punch, but Rachel raised her arm just in time to block it from reaching her face. Sion and Rachel clashed head-on, their eyes locked in a fierce stare. Sion seized her wrist, halting her attack, and demanded, "How long are you planning to keep following me around?" Rachel's eyes widened, and a dark smile spread across her face as she realized this was indeed the real Sion she knew and cherished. She was thrilled to see him again after such a long time. Sion stared at her with a stern expression, still gripping her wrist. Rachel found it odd that he was following the old woman from the snack shop as if she were his parent. There was no way that a shabby snack shop owner could be a client of Dead Mansion. Sion looked surprised. He didn't know what she was talking about. He hadn't caused a big fuss and didn't expect her to find him so quickly. As he spoke with Rachel, she suddenly ducked, uninterested in further discussion. Planting one foot firmly on the ground, she grabbed Sion, twisted her body, lifted him into the air, and slammed him onto the floor. With a loud slam, Sion closed his eyes and gritted his teeth in pain. Rachel, now sitting on top of him, moved her hands towards his stomach and insisted he should return to the Dead Mansion. Touching his hair affectionately, Rachel leaned forward with a stern gaze and stated that many clients were waiting for him. Reflecting on his memories of the Dead Mansion, Sion recalled how he had outperformed his peers at every level. Back then, he was known as Sion Park. He also remembered a woman with her eyes hidden by black hair who gave him that name when he got hurt. Sion, now confused, wondered aloud why that particular memory had resurfaced. Rachel, still sitting on top of him, didn't understand what he was saying and asked him to repeat it. Regaining consciousness, Sion realized Rachel was sitting on him and swiftly headbutted her in the nose. Rachel screamed, closing her eyes in pain. She leaped off Sion, her right hand covering her mouth while her left hand was partially outstretched as she slid backward. Rachel stared menacingly, her hand and nose covered in blood. She pressed her thumb on the right side of her nostril and blew out the blood. She noted that Sion wasn't going to come back quietly. However, by the time she looked up, Sion was no longer there. Sion ran through the back alley, incredulous that the Dead Mansion would send Rachel to capture him. Visions of the black-haired woman resurfaced. He still didn't know who she was. With a steely gaze, he pressed forward. In Russia, dark clouds gathered above the Dead Mansion. The priest, visibly annoyed, was on the phone with Rachel. She informed him that she had lost sight of Sion, prompting the priest to question how she could have let that happen. Rachel rushed into the women's public restroom, pushing aside an elderly woman who was about to enter. She quickly locked herself in a cubicle, informing the priest that she had let her guard down for just a moment. She locked the door and hung her high school blazer on the hook before starting to unbutton her shirt. Still on the phone with the priest, she informed him that she had discovered who was controlling Sion. It was the old woman, connected to the three principles. As she tilted her head to the right, blood from the headbutt with Sion smeared across her nose. She removed her white school shirt, revealing her pale skin marked with scratches across her arms, chest, and shoulders. From what Rachel had observed, it appeared that Sion viewed the old woman as a parental figure. The priest set his phone on the table and put Rachel on speaker, propping his left elbow on the surface and resting his chin on his hand. He finally grasped that Sion was following the old woman's commands. He asked Rachel if it was even feasible for the old woman to intentionally manipulate the three principles. Rachel adjusted a new mask with her left hand and informed the priest that she needed further confirmation, though it didn't seem likely at the moment. The priest, maintaining a serious expression and still resting his hand on his chin, instructed Rachel to investigate the old woman first. As Rachel opened the toilet door, the elderly woman she had pushed aside shouted at her, insisting that she was in line first and that a young woman like Rachel shouldn't cut in. However, when the old woman turned to look at Rachel again, she realized that Rachel was no longer a young woman. Rachel, now in a gray coat and purple blouse, had traded her brunette hair for a short gray cut. Sporting sunglasses, she walked past the old woman, who could only stare back in stunned silence. The priest leaned back in his chair, resting his elbows on the chair arms and interlocking his fingers. He explained to Rachel that there were two methods to retrieve a good child from their parents. The first approach was to confront Hyunho's mother and request that she stay away from Sion. Rachel, now disguised as an elderly woman, approached Hyunho's mother, adjusting her sunglasses with one hand. She told the old woman that due to her frequent business trips, she hadn't been able to keep a close eye on Sion. With a fork in hand, she stabbed a piece of spicy meat and remarked that Sion couldn't handle spicy food. Hyunho's mother looked down, unable to meet Rachel's gaze, clearly unaware that Sion couldn't handle spicy food. Rachel smiled, watching the old woman with a calculating expression. The first method to reclaim a good child is to instill enough guilt in the guardian that they willingly relinquish their claim. Rachel was determined to make this old woman feel the weight of her control over Sion. The old woman, still staring at the ground with her hands tightly clutching her apron, seemed overwhelmed. Rachel stood up and declared that Sion would heed her commands, emphasizing that the old woman must take responsibility as an adult. Placing a firm hand on the woman's shoulder, Rachel urged her to instruct Sion that if he ever appeared again, she should command him to return to the dead mansion. As Rachel walked away, the old woman paused, her silence indicating that she had understood Rachel's message. However, she soon clenched her hands into fists and resolutely declared that she would not comply. Rachel, taken aback by the old woman's refusal to release Sion, turned to face her. The old woman continued, explaining that Rachel's frequent business trips meant she was unaware of Sion's current situation. Without making eye contact, she asked Rachel if she had truly observed Sion's face or his clothing, and whether she understood the nature of his school life. Rachel turned away, her smile fading. The old woman observed that Sion often wore disheveled clothes and had a dirty face. Whenever she inquired about it, he would smile and say he had simply fallen. Initially, she accepted this explanation, believing it to be typical behavior for a growing boy. The old woman began to cry, recalling how her own son used to offer the same excuses whenever he came home with messy clothes and unkempt hair. She couldn't bear to see Sion end up like that, so she found herself taking care of him whenever she could, despite not realizing how deeply she had become involved. The old woman clenched her fist with determination and declared that Sion needed a guardian because she couldn't bear to see him end up like her own son. She insisted that if Rachel was too busy, she would be more than willing to take on the responsibility of watching over him. Rachel turned to the old woman, locking eyes with her and shaking her head slightly in disagreement. She firmly stated that she could not accept someone like her to care for Sion. The old woman, bowing her head, regretfully informed Rachel that she couldn't comply with her earlier request. Rachel, her frustration rising, gritted her teeth and clenched her fist. After leaving Hyunho's residence, Rachel headed to a nearby back alley. She contacted the priest to report that her initial attempt had failed. It turned out that the old woman was more stubborn than anticipated and refused to relinquish her claim over Sion. As Rachel changed out of her clothes and disposed of them in a nearby bin, she relayed the details of the encounter to the priest. The priest replied, acknowledging that the situation was unfortunate, but emphasizing the need to resolve it discreetly if possible. He instructed Rachel to move on to the second phase of their plan. With a determined and steely expression, Rachel adjusted her t-shirt, preparing for the next step. Rachel tore off her t-shirt and explained that the second phase involves retrieving a good child from their parents by returning them to the dead mansion in the event of the parents' death. She confirmed to the priest that the new target was now the old woman. Rachel walked into the convenience store, wearing a black cap and jacket. She positioned herself a few feet away from the old woman, who was picking up a bag of onions, completely unaware of her presence. Rachel gripped a detonator in her hand, which had two buttons, one red and one black. With her thumb hovering over the red button, she glared at the old woman, silently cursing her for taking Sion away from her. Rachel pressed the red button, causing the device in the back of the store to explode. The blast rocked the rear of the store, and civilians turned in horror as the explosion unfolded. The store's sprinklers activated, and Hyunho's mother turned in shock. Behind her, Rachel stood with her cap shadowing her left eye, her right eye fixed menacingly on the old woman. Holding a gun, Rachel was poised to shoot, determined not to let the old woman take on the role of Sion's guardian. Rachel fired the gun, but Sion leaped into the path of the bullet, intercepting it with a frying pan. The pan deflected the shot away from the old woman, protecting her from harm. Rachel's wicked smile widened as she watched Sion deflect the bullet. The impact caused him to stumble back a few feet. Staring at the frying pan, he realized he had seen a similar scenario in a video game and decided to try it out. To his surprise, it actually worked. Dropping the frying pan, Sion approached Rachel with a fierce gaze, his right hand clenched into a fist. While he had anticipated that she would come after the old woman, he hadn't expected the bombs and the guns. This was excessive. Rachel's eyes locked onto Sion's as she declared that he should not interfere with her plans. She was determined to free him from the old woman's influence. The old woman began to cough, closing her eyes and covering her mouth. Her coughing drew Sion's attention away from Rachel to check on her. Meanwhile, with a deadly glare, Rachel aimed her gun at the old woman's back once more. Sion leaped backward, attempting to knock over the heavy shelves to create a barrier between himself and Rachel. Seeing this, Rachel darted to her left to avoid the falling shelves, gritting her teeth as she raised her pistol closer to her face. Rachel peeked out to check if the old woman was still there, but to her surprise, it was Sion. He kicked her hand, causing her to release the gun. She then pulled out a short knife strapped behind her back. Though she wanted to take Sion back to the dead mansion without harming him, her eyes locked onto Sion, and she knew she would have to hurt him. Rachel moved swiftly, slashing at his belly. Blood splattered to the ground, or so it seemed. In reality, it was just the tomato ketchup tin he was holding that got punctured in the process. With a fierce look, he knew he couldn't let Rachel leave unharmed. Sion tossed the ketchup tin away, causing her to lose her balance and lose her weapon. He quickly tried to smash her with his knee, but she ducked, questioning whether Sion could really take her down, given her extensive training. Rachel kicked his feet out from under him, sending him crashing into the shelves. Fighting should be a means to an end, she thought, considering this a supplementary lesson for him. Rachel crouched down in front of him, pulling out another knife from behind her back. With a piercing gaze, she asked him what the purpose of this fight was. Meanwhile, Hyunho's mother was trying to make sense of the chaos when she noticed a small child on the floor, crying desperately. Amid all the commotion, he was sobbing for his mom. The old woman rushed over, asking if he was hurt. The boy, his face buried in his hands, said he couldn't find his mom. Turning to face the old woman with tears in his eyes, he explained he didn't know where she was. The little boy asked the old woman if she could help him find his mother, all the while clutching a knife in his left hand.